podium for a special guest, I just wanted to echo a few words. And particularly, I wanted to once again bring up the points that were raised earlier by two of our members of parliament from Ukraine, Andriy as well as Volker, that we need to understand where Ukraine has come from over the past 5 years. And as they both said, a lot of positive has happened, a lot of hundreds of laws have been adopted, an army that maybe stood at 20, is a strong standing army. And no one needs to point out that Ukraine is at war with Russia, not only on the front lines, but in terms of a daily facet, in terms of what's happening on a daily basis. Yes, there's more to do. Yes, there are problems that still need to be addressed. But I think it's about time that we started emphasizing the positives that have happened in Ukraine, positives that have happened in the relationship between the United States and Ukraine and the strategic partnership that we've had. Ukraine has not lost its democracy. Let's remember that. And I think we need to start talking about the positive nature of where Ukraine stands today. To address the theme of why a free, prosperous, and secure Ukraine still matters from the U.S. perspective is our special guest. I don't really like to read large biographical details, but I do want to point out several key points here. As everyone knows, Ambassador Volker is leading expert in U.S. foreign and national security policy over the last 30 years. He served as U.S. Ambassador to NATO. Since July 2017, he was appointed as U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. He travels to Ukraine extensively, has visited the front lines in adjoining demarcation zone. He's met with Ukraine's soldiers. He's correctly assessed that the conflict is a hot war and not a frozen conflict, and consistently stresses that Russian aggression is to blame for the violence in Eastern Europe, and to better engage in the peace process. The dialogue with Russia needs to be based on the principles of Ukraine's territorial integrity. We appreciate his leadership and commitment, and as many of you remember last year when he spoke at our conference in New York, the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America had honored Ambassador Volker with the Friend of Ukraine Award for his extraordinary leadership in assisting Ukraine, and his understanding that Ukraine fights for democracy, human rights, freedom, and for Western values. As the ambassador was walking in, we had a brief conversation. I hope that you don't mind this, but the ambassador had a little celebration last evening that I know that one of our members of parliament from Ukraine had attended. But congratulations on your engagement. And in the practice, he had mentioned to myself and to Mikhailo Salkiv that as they're packing and moving from a house to an apartment, he happened to run across that award we had given him. So he's got it near and dear with him, and we appreciate your continued leadership and look forward to your comments.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the warm congratulations. I thought I would just run through a few things, start off the conversation. Happy to discuss and answer questions and things that are going on as well. I want to start with something that we haven't said very much lately because we haven't needed to. But I just want to remind all of you that the administration's objectives in working with Ukraine have been unchanged for 2 years now, since I first had a meeting with Secretary of State Tillerson about taking on this role. And he asked if I'd be interested, and I said, well, I want to make sure I understand what the goals are. And I said, in my mind, the goals need to be the restoration of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the safety and security of all Ukrainian citizens, regardless of ethnicity, nationality, or religion. And He had not heard it formulated that way before, but he said, absolutely, that's our goal. And so he said it first in his remarks in July 2017, and we've been consistent on that theme over time. And I feel that while Russia has not changed its approach to Ukraine, we have made a lot of headway in strengthening support for those objectives, in seeing Ukraine become stronger and more resilient and have a stronger identity, and have greater support from the Europeans and from the United States, and for this now to have changed the equation in a way where time is now more on Ukraine's side than it was on Russia's side before. So I think that is a positive set of developments. Now, as you know, Ukraine recently had its presidential election and is in the throes of a parliamentary election campaign, with those elections to be held on July 21st. So a couple of thoughts on that. I want to be clear that President Poroshenko did a great job at a difficult time in Ukraine's history. And I don't think people should forget that. Ukraine was attacked. They had to defend the country to try to win back some territory, to stabilize the border, the boundary inside the country. He had to build international support, he had to rebuild the military, and he got more done on reform in Ukraine during his tenure as president than all of the preceding presidents did since Ukraine's independence. So that was a lot of accomplishment. But what we saw in the election that took place, the presidential election, is that not only did he do that, but the Ukrainian people wanted more. They wanted more, faster, better, newer, fresher, younger, different, change everything. Sounds familiar. And and that is, I think, what now President Zelensky was promising. He was a face who had never been in politics before. He's a generation younger. He would have been 13 when Ukraine regained its independence. That is going to be a different kind of person than someone who had been active politically and in business and other things during the Soviet system. So there's a change here, and I think that was one thing that people latched onto. He promised to take reform further and deeper and faster, and that's what the public bought into. But I think that his words, his television show, his statements about Ukraine and the system, of how much influence the oligarchs have over politics, judiciary, economy, life in Ukraine, and frankly, to press the success of the country. He understood that, and he communicated that, and I think that was another big factor in why people decided to vote. Now, there is a lot of watching as he has become president and does not have a majority of votes in the body at this time. What will he actually do? That's what he said. What will he actually do? And we've seen some very good names brought into his circle that are known as reformers or are known as being very pro-Atlanticist and very pro-European for Ukraine. And we've seen others that have ties to oligarchs and raise concerns about what direction this is heading. But with 73% of the people who voted in the second round of the presidential election voting for him, he now has an obligation to those people that he will deliver on what he promised to deliver on. And from the perspective of the United States or Western Europe, we look at this and say, well, there's something changing in Ukraine. And the future of Ukraine for the next 5 years is probably going to be charted. It's going to be determined in the next 3 months. And everybody is going to be trying to influence that, whether it's the Russians, or whether it's the oligarchs, or whether it's reformers. Everybody is going to be trying to shape that. So it is imperative for the United States, for the European Union, and even for European countries, to do everything possible to try to engage with President Zelensky now and help him achieve what he said he will achieve. And this will require a demonstration of independence and that he is really the president and that he is really in charge. It can't be a situation where he even gives the appearance of favoring an oligarch or favoring some or not changing the system for his own political good fortunes and for our relationships going forward. He needs to be able to achieve a working majority in the parliament that can support a reform agenda, and he needs to be able to deliver on that agenda. And I think it's incumbent on the United States and others to say that if he delivers on that agenda, we will be giving our full support to that as well, and we want to see that be successful. You'll remember during the election campaign, there's a lot of pressure on everybody to take a position. Do you support this candidate? Do you support that candidate? And I very much argued that we don't do that, and we won't do that. We will not support an individual. We will support principles and policies. And that is still the case now that we know who won the election. We support the same principles and the same policies, and we want to see them realized. I'm very pleased that so far we've done as much as we can, and we intend to keep doing it. President Trump called, well, I should back up. Secretary of State Pompeo called President Poroshenko and candidate Poroshenko on the eve, and candidate Zelensky on the eve of the election. And President Trump congratulated President Zelensky on the night after he had won the election. The inauguration, as you know, was put together very quickly. We thought it might come a little bit later, and so we put together a U.S. presidential delegation on about 2 days' notice, which included a cabinet secretary, Rick Perry, the Secretary of Energy, included U.S. Senator Ron Johnson, included our ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, and myself, the National Security Council staffer, and Ashar Zak. So it was a robust, and I would say high-level American delegation that went to the inauguration. Not true of a lot of countries, I must say. The Baltic states sent their presidents, Georgia sent its president. I'm very impressed to see that solidarity in the region is very important. Not too many others sent that high-level delegation, but the United States was fully represented. We then came back as a delegation and met with President Trump and briefed him about our impressions and how we think we need to be acting in the coming period. And we have begun to take steps on that, including President Trump sending a letter to President Zelensky congratulating him and inviting him to come for a visit to the White House at a date to be determined. And we are still working on getting a date, but believe me, we will. And we will also look for other opportunities to engage to support that reform agenda that I talked about. It is easy to forget that all of this has taken place in 23 days. It seems like it was longer ago, and a lot has been done, and a lot has happened in that period of time. And there was a rich agenda going forward. There will be bilateral visits to Paris and Berlin. There was already a meeting with Secretary General Stoltenberg where President Zelensky affirmed his commitment to Ukraine's aspiration to join NATO, very important, I would argue. There were also senior level EU meetings. There will be an EU summit in early July. There will be the reform conference on Ukrainian economic reform hosted by Canada on July 2nd and 3rd. We are already committed. I will be there, but Deputy Secretary of State Sullivan will be there. We are looking further at who else we may be able to get there to make sure we have a robust American presence at that as well. And we will be looking at further senior level visits to Kyiv coming up because we want to follow through on that commitment that if there is a chance for Ukraine to really break out of an oligarchic system that has dominated the country since the early days of privatization, we need to take that chance now. And we will do everything we can to be as helpful as we can. I have a couple other thoughts. Are we live tape here? Okay, so be careful. But I mentioned the presence of Baltic state leaders and Georgian leaders at the inauguration. I want to play this back into the United States. A lot of you are active in Ukrainian and American communities. And there needs to be a reinvestment in solidarity among our Central East European diaspora groups here in this country. Ukrainians, Georgians, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks. Individually, there may be some that are larger in number, like the Poles, some that are smaller in number, like the Estonians. but collectively you have a shared memory, a shared set of understandings about what's going on in the world, and your voices do matter. And this was a very important factor in achieving the historic enlargements of NATO 20 years ago for Poland and Czech Republic, Hungary 15 years ago for the Prague summits and the Baltic states, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia. And I think when we talk about Ukraine and its aspirations, and when we talk about Georgia and its desire to join NATO and the EU, that it's important that this community be strong and be together. Just like NATO itself, victory for one is a victory for all. And I think that's a point that should be stressed, especially as we head into a fresh political season in this country. With that, I will pause. I'd love to take a few questions and give any comments on those, and have a good conversation, because I'm surrounded by experts and practitioners and participants in this process in Ukraine, and I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for your thoughts on, and I would like to make one comment and then follow up with a question and then turn it over to our audience here. I'm glad that you raised the issue in terms of cooperation and working together with other nationality groups. I think that's something that the Ukrainian community nationally, that's evident here in Washington in our work with the Central and Eastern European Coalition, but also that's a model that's been taken to our local communities. I'm proud to say that communities like Cleveland, particularly where I'm from, Philadelphia, and others, are very good examples of movements that have formed in terms of coalitions, particularly with our Eastern European brothers and sisters and nationalities. And that's something that we continue to stress. That's something that we continue to impress upon our communities that they need to work on it. So I'm glad that you raised that particular issue. My question to you is, and I know we're in public here, but and you acknowledge this, I acknowledge this, others acknowledge this, that a lot has been done in terms of progress, and credit needs to be given to President Poroshenko for his work in Parliament and others. In terms of U.S. priorities at further reform, where are the U.S. priorities in terms of wanting those next changes? Is it with the reform of the security service? Is it still in the energy sector? Where can possibly, in some of these efforts, we can engage ourselves as well to be helpful to convince members of Parliament or the current Ukrainian government in terms of things that they need to act to?
Well, thank you, and that's a great question. And you're tempted to say, well, it's hard to know where to start. But there are a few places that we do highlight. One of them is continued pursuit of some of the anti-corruption measures that have been in place. There are a few, such as the restoration of legislation that prohibits illicit wealth accumulation by members of Parliament. That was struck down by the court. It needs to be revised and be approved. There is the maintenance of the nationalization of Privatbank, which of course was the Olexy bank, but this was a significant drain of resources that the Ukrainian people eventually had to fill through nationalization, and ultimately the IMF contributions and others have helped to restore the Ukrainian national budget. So we're paying for this too. And it's very important that we not see a reversal of cleaning up of that bank. And that those who put in the investments are not then seeing those frittered away again. So that's a very important reform. Reforms in the judiciary. It's very important that we have a qualified, credible, and independent judiciary for the administration of the rule of law. And I think it is particularly important also to look at the oligarchic system itself. You have a situation where too few people own too much. And that gives undue influence over lots of things, the judiciary, the Verado, the media. And this deters foreign investment, which in turn, it creates a situation where corruption is possible. and that also deters foreign investment, and that depresses Ukrainian economic growth, it depresses jobs, it depresses wages, and it holds the country back. Ukraine, by all rights, should be a wealthy country. It has fabulous people, fabulous natural resources. It has a great location and great agriculture, great soil. Everything about Ukraine should be productive. And it's not achieving that, and I think this is one of the fundamental reasons. So a reform of the system, such as implementation of antitrust legislation, rigorous implementation of antitrust legislation, would be a very important step. And I think it needs to be done in a way that brings the country together as well. One of the things we saw in Georgia after the Georgian Dream was first elected was a 3-year period of retribution against the United National Movement after they took power, which was wasting time in Georgia. And it really set the country back. The country is doing very well again now, but it took time for that Georgian Dream government to find its footing and start governing, and now it's doing very well in governance. I don't think Ukraine should go the direction of political retribution. I think it should go the direction of finding the right formulas for rule of law and the implementation of that, and cleaning up the economy, and as necessary, if people give up their assets and follow the rules, pay a tax, give an amnesty as well, and get beyond this and move forward. I think that would be a significant direction that can be achieved. You mentioned the energy sector, and there are several things in the energy sector that are important. I note the Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry, was the leader of the U.S. presidential delegation for the inauguration. He's talked about assisting Ukraine with gas storage, which I think is important. We want to make sure that any shut-off of Russian gas transit in Ukraine does not have an adverse impact on Ukraine, and that means finding ways to fill out the gas reserve caverns that are there. But he also talked about a few reforms that are essential. Unbundling of distribution and making competitive the gas transit system. Opening up upstream production. Ukraine should be a net energy producer and exporter. It shouldn't be dependent on anybody for oil and gas, and yet it is. And so I think that opening that up to foreign investment, for upstream investment, is another essential reform to help Ukraine out. I think naphtha gas needs further reform, and as a company, however that comes out, there are different ways, but I think that needs further attention. And I think the reform of the defense industrial sector is good. This was something that was exposed during the course of the presidential campaign, but everybody knew it anyway. But it happened to be exposed in a dramatic way, and it was really time to clean that up as well. It can't serve as that kind of slush fund anymore. And I think Ukraine has quality defense industries, which could be viable internationally and could be successful, but they need to be unbundled from this big conglomerate, and they need to be made successful on their own terms and clean up the corruption in that sector as well. As I mentioned, there have been some good appointments in this area, and I think the chair of the National Security and Defense Council is serious about these reform issues, and that knows that they are critical to Ukraine's national security. I think that Brahmovicius is quite capable of taking the helm of the defense establishment reform. We'll see how that goes. I think that Vistayko is an excellent choice for foreign minister, and currently serving as diplomatic advisor. He's extraordinarily pro-NATO, pro-Western, and committed, and easy to work with, and I think that he can do a good job there. But these are things that, while we talk about them, they need to be done, and they're hard to do. There are forces that oppose these things in Ukraine, which is why it's important that the United States and Europe and others support the government as long as it is pursuing this agenda.
Let's open it up for questions. Mr. Root.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. First of all, thank you for your service to this country, which are all citizens. I want to go to your point that you opened up your conversation with, or your talk on goals. There's no strategy without a policy. There's no policy without a goal. We know that. The question is this, going beyond Ukraine alone, but it subsumes Ukraine. What is the American goal vis-a-vis our relations with Russia, and specifically, is there any consideration of going beyond the reactive responding mode that we seem to be in sort of almost a knee-jerk fashion operating in, and looking to put Putin, having him turn inward with issues and problems that he has in Russia, and there's tons of them. Is there any reconceptualization of our policy, if there is one, about Russia? Thank you.
It's a great question, and since I'm not in charge of Russia policy, I can explain, but I can't say this is something that I'm doing. Let's take a look at the balance sheet for just a minute. We have Ukraine, we have Georgia, we have arms, INF issues, we have other nuclear issues, we have kind of roguish military behavior, we have Syria, we have Iran, we have Venezuela, we have North Korea. I'm sure I'm leaving a few out. Disinformation, electoral campaign interference, trying to divide the European Union and NATO and to bring down Western governments. Okay. Probably still left a few out. But there's nothing in all that set of issues that's on the positive side of the ledger between the U.S. and Russia. None of these are things where this is the United States making trouble and we have a problem with Russia getting in our way. It's quite the opposite. It's that Russia is taking the initiative to make trouble in these areas, and we are trying to block that and reverse it. Now, this is not a good situation. I mean, if you have such a negative agenda and such a negative relationship with Russia, this is not where anyone rationally would want to be. It would be good to try to find some things where you can agree on something, where you could work together to accomplish a good in the world, where there's some way of balancing out this sort of negative relationship with something positive. And I think that is a fair description of where our policy is that you've seen in the Trump administration a much tougher policy on dealing with Russia, bad behavior, than we had under the previous administration. And you've also seen a willingness to keep the door open, that we're willing to talk with Russia, we're willing to try to solve these problems, we're willing to have high-level meetings, but it's got to be on the basis of substance that we can actually agree on and achieve. We're not in the business of just, wrapping bows on bad policies and giving them away. We actually have to have real substance, and unfortunately, we haven't had that. So we are stuck in this dynamic of, on the one hand, seriously pushing back on all of these policy issues, whether it's Venezuela or Syria or Iran or Ukraine and so forth, while keeping that door open to dialogue. And Russia is so far not taking us up on it.
Yes.
Thank you. Ambassador, again, thank you for your service and your patience and your steady hand at the helm. We appreciate that. I have two sort of quick comments on your focus in your presentation on the need to dismantle the oligarchic structures as a fundamental tenet of a sustainable strategy to establish legitimacy of government, but also, I take it, as part of the peace process, from what you're saying. So two questions. One is, have you considered using this moment of political opportunity to somehow, work with the government of Ukraine and with the financial industrial leaders of the country to engage them in some self-regulation of what they do in their financial behavior with their informal practices. Because antitrust, it would be great if that started to work and work in a meaningful way, but it would be more efficient if there was some willingness of oligarchs themselves to self-regulate around their informal practices. So it's a suggestion it's something that you might think about if you haven't already. And the other is a question directly to your point about the corruption in the defense sector. Do you see a quid pro quo between the United States giving more defense assistance at this stage and demanding of, Ukrainian Pro and the Ministry of Defense that they clean up their act and make sure that any aid and assistance that we may give will actually have an efficient national security result? Thank you.
Two good questions. Thank you very much. On the self-regulation question, the problem here is very, very complicated. The first thing is that Zelensky doesn't have actual power at the moment. He has the power of goodwill and public opinion, but he doesn't have votes in the Rada. He's not going to get any legislation passed until after the Rada elections and a new Rada takes office, and we don't know what that will look like. We think he might get a majority, but he might not. It might be a coalition that produces a government, might not. So we have to see how the election shakes out. But in order to pass any legislation that's going to change anything, you're going to need the new Rada seated. It's not going to happen in the current situation. In terms of the behavior of oligarchs, they see no incentive at the moment to do anything other than what they normally do. It works. So there's no incentive, and there's competition. And no one is going to be the first one to be a chump and say, well, I'll behave, but nobody else will. So you do need legislation, and you do need outside pressure. You're absolutely right, and part of what you're implying is that it needs to be Ukrainian-led. No one can do this from outside. This has to come from the Ukrainian leadership, that there's a determination there to reform the system. And then we can provide support to that, but it can't be imposed from outside by any stretch. And I think there is an incentive to be created for oligarchs. They, in my view, want to be seen as legitimate international business people. They have made a lot of money, but it is under a cloud, and they want to be able to get out from under that cloud. But they just want to make sure they can do it in a way that they feel is not prejudiced against them, and that they can emerge from this in a successful way. I think that's achievable, but we have to create the right incentive structure. As for the defense reforms, these are not linked in the way that you suggest. The United States Senate and Congress are very committed to providing annual doses of military assistance for Ukraine. We had FMF of $250 million a year ago, it's probably $300 million this year. There's a commitment to doing this as strong bipartisan support. And we'll do that because we want to see the Ukrainian military increase its capacities. We want to see it better able to defend the country because that's the best deterrent to new aggression. Separate from that, we do want to see substantial reform in the defense industrial sector in Ukraine. We also want to see it in the military command and the Ministry of Defense. But in the defense industrial sector, we also want to see it, but that it's not a conditionality. Where there is a hint of conditionality, I wouldn't call it quite conditionality, but a hint of it anyway, is that this needs to be a two-way street. It can't be a situation where the United States and U.S. taxpayers are year on year providing funds to Ukrainian defense forces, and Ukraine is not reciprocating with engagement, commitment with the United States military, with defense purchases from the United States to augment what we are giving to Ukraine. It needs to be a two-way street, because if it's not, it's not going to last for as long as we would like.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have come to an end. The high signs have been given. Again, on behalf of the organizers here and our community and everyone involved here, thank you for your commitment. Thank you for your leadership. I look forward to running into you at the airports in Frankfurt and Munich like I usually do. I think I see you more at airports than anywhere else. So thank you again. Thank you for addressing this audience.
Thank you for having me.
Before everyone departs, we're going to have concluding remarks by Tamara Olexy, who has calculated and tabulated the report card, and she will give us a synopsis of today's event.
Thank you, Andriy. I realize that we are very short on time. We're a few minutes over, but as has been tradition, I've been asked to provide a brief summation of the 7th annual report card. The topic, as Walter affectionately calls it, brutality. Throughout the day, we've had an opportunity to hear from numerous experts, both from government and NGOs. We've listened to various opinions from the United States and the country in question, Ukraine. And although the analysis may have varied, the common thread is hope for the future and a desire to see Ukraine truly a strong, independent, and prosperous country. I know that we've had some discussions today saying that analysis that the reform should be much quicker. And I have to say I am in somewhat agreement with that, but I also think we have to be cognizant of the fact that Ukraine is fighting a hot war. The only hot war on the European continent. And for over 5 years, we've been losing men and women on an almost daily basis. Russia has illegally occupied the Crimean Peninsula. I can't even call it annexed because it's occupied, and parts of Donbass. And so this is a war for Ukraine's true survival, its sovereignty and territorial integrity. However, despite all of this, from my vantage point, I believe that advancement has overcome retreat. Over the last year, Ukraine continues to make great strides in various different reforms, and I'm not going to go through them. We've heard some of them today. But I just want to say that most recently was a culmination of free and fair elections and the peaceful transfer of power. And I think that they've proved to the world, and they've shown the world that they really do want to transform their country into a modern European democracy. So without further ado, I'd like to present the conference's findings. And truth be told, I thought my job would be a little bit easier, but unfortunately I think I have to be a statistician with the various different grades that I have been receiving throughout the day. Perhaps some of our younger students that are here, I've been out of school for a long time, and maybe they can better assess this, but I hope I do my best to express what I've heard from the various different experts that we had here today, because there were multiple grades. Some were based on contingencies, and they were deciphering different grading systems. But for our first panel, it was the robust democratic politics. The average was a B-. For market economies, it was a C+. For general security, it was a C. For energy security, I would say it's a B-, C+. For social cohesion, a B. And for national identity, a B to a B+. I might have scaled it a little bit on the positive side because I am a glasses half full person rather than glasses half empty, and I do personally have seen quite a few positive steps in the last year. So in closing, on behalf of all of the sponsoring organizations, and there are many of them, I will briefly name them all because they all deserve thanks for putting this conference together. The American Foreign Policy Council, Center for U.S.-Ukraine Relations, International Republican Institute, National Democratic Institute, Open World Program, Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, Ukrainian National Information Service, and U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. I'd like to sincerely thank all of the speakers, both from the United States and those that traveled from Ukraine, to share their expertise and knowledge with us here today. And I also like to thank all of you who came in attendance, because I know you have all busy schedules. You traveled as far as Australia and London to join us here in Washington, and I want to sincerely thank you for doing that. I think this is a very timely and important forum, and I want to thank Walter for, he is the specialist in organizing all of the speakers. So Walter, thank you for all your hard work. And finally, on behalf of all of our organizations, we have to thank all of our sponsors, as has been displayed up here. It's without their financial assistance, we wouldn't have been able to pull this off today. So I would like to sincerely thank the Heritage Foundation of the First Security Federal Savings Bank, the Jurkiw Family Fund, Self-Reliance New York Federal Credit Union, and Summa Yonkers Federal Credit Union. Thank you, and Slava Ukraini.